reset mindset, which was a fascinating hour and a quarter into how we can think and prepare ourselves as we move forward in this rather torrid time. Then we had Signify doing a presentation on UVC tech, which was also very well attended. We had James Simpson on digital theatre, which also got a great audience. And we finished up with Chauvet yesterday, who did a couple of product presentations. Today promises to be equally as good, or shall I say it's building with excitement as the days go on, I'd like to think. So this morning, we have a friend of ours who's been delivering sessions for Plaza for several years now. And when I first met this particular person, I was back in school, I think I was, business school, which is where I first met him. It is Roger Martin Fagg, the well-renowned behavioral economist. So some of you will remember him from previous sessions we've done online. We did one earlier this year, and also he has supported us at our AGM a couple of times to keep us up to date with what's going on with his predictions of the economy. So before I hand over to him, you'll still know that Roger and I have another thing in common, which is that we're both musicians, but he is also very well known for many bank jobs he's done in the past, of which he's still on the run for several of them. So I will hand over to Roger in a moment. But before I do that, just want to say thank you for supporting the events this week. I hope you get something of value out of them. And if you get time and you want to look at other ways of supporting Plaza and what we're doing, please go to our website, or indeed WeMakeEvents.com, and have a look at ways you can get involved and support and help support the industry. Thank you very much again, and I'll hand over to Roger.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, all. I hope you can hear me. What I'm going to do this morning is in two parts. The first part is simply a description on how our economy works. The second part, what is actually going on. Now, many of you probably get your information on the economy from the media. And I have to say these days, a lot of that information is pretty misleading. And the media seem to want to emphasize the downside, the misery, how awful it is. And yeah, there's a lot of problems, and particularly your industry, I know, is suffering. However, there are some fundamentals, and I don't want to sound like Boris Johnson, but there are some fundamentals which suggest that assuming we avoid national lockdowns, things will be better than most of the media are telling us. So let's start with the basic structure of the economy. Next slide. So short-run growth in GDP basically depends on how much money there is and how often it gets spent. The amount of money is what we call M, and how often it gets spent is velocity, V. M multiplied by V gives us nominal GDP. A nominal GDP is the total value of goods and services sold. Nominal GDP is not real GDP, so it's value, not volume. To get real growth, we adjust nominal for inflation. Now, to understand how this thing works, I'd like you to think of a hose pipe, your garden hose pipe. And when you put the pipe on the tap at one end and you turn the tap on, with a time lag, what went into the pipe from the tap should come out at the nozzle end, assuming, of course, there are no holes in your pipe. Well, the economy is just like a big pipe, and the water in our pipe is our money supply. And so what I'm going to be looking at is what's happening to the amount of money going into our pipe and the indicators of how it's flowing through our pipe. Can we look at the next slide? So there it is. There is a money tap, and then there is flow between government, business, and consumers. So under normal circumstances, the amount of money going into that pipe grows at 4% a year, and the value of what comes out of the pipe, believe it or not, also grows at 4% a year. The time lag between what goes into the pipe and when it comes out of the pipe depends on confidence. It can be as quick as 6 months, it can take as long as 2 years. Now, please assume that you're watering your garden, your tap's fully turned on, and your neighbour comes round for a chat. Unfortunately, your neighbour is somewhat overweight and he inadvertently stands on your pipe. The pressure at the tap end doesn't change. The amount coming out the nozzle end reduces to a dribble. Next slide. Lockdown is basically your neighbour standing on the pipe. And you can see that the flow through the pipe is much smaller. And in fact, in Q2 of this year, nominal GDP was 20% smaller than Q1. But the government reacted to the lockdown by actually turning the tap up. And this was the furloughing scheme, which is still running but changing its form, spend on health and the extra spend on universal credit. So we have an interesting situation where lockdown prevents some of the flow, but also increases the amount going into the pipe. Next slide. So as soon as lockdown ended, there was a significant increase in flow. And GDP in the first month after the end of lockdown was 12% higher. And we have the month of August data, which unfortunately showed GDP didn't grow as we expected at another 4%, it grew at about 2.2%. And why is that? Well, it's August. A lot of people were staycationing. Okay, next slide. You see, when we look at our system, we've got to look at how money gets into our pipe. And under normal circumstances, money gets in because banks create it. When someone goes to a bank to ask for a loan, the bank has to decide whether to make that loan. And when they decide, yes, we'll lend, the loan, as far as the bank is concerned, is an asset because it's going to give the bank income. But the borrower believes they've got the amount of the loan to spend. So a bank creates money out of nothing by writing the amount of the loan in the borrower's account, which is on the liabilities of the bank's balance sheet. Now, over the last 30 years, British banks have done everything they can to take cost out of their business. So they've automated as much of the business as they can. This automation means they love mortgages because mortgage approvals, mortgage applications are very easy to automate. And that is why the mortgage business dominates in Britain. More than half our money supply is mortgage lending. Bank lending for growing businesses, for equipment, for working capital is only 12% of our money supply. Okay. The other thing about the mortgage business is because everyone's in it and everyone's competing, prices are keen. and it's become a pilot high, sell it cheap business. And that's important, as we'll see a bit later. Next slide. In exceptional circumstances, the central bank does exactly what commercial banks do, but it does it by lending to the government. It buys government debt and creates the money out of nothing to purchase that debt. It's called quantitative easing. And furloughing, which cost about 56 billion, was all new money. It wasn't taxpayers' money. Next slide. I think this is the most important slide in my deck, and I want to spend a bit of time on it. What that red line shows you is the growth in the money supply. That is the liabilities of the British banking system. The black line shows the growth in their lending. And under normal circumstances, those two lines move together, as you see in the period after 2015 and up to 2020. In exceptional times, those lines diverge. And that's what QE enables. If you look at that first period, banks were actually calling in loans, so they were reducing their assets, and yet the money supply continued to grow. That's because the Bank of England was creating it. And you'll see in this last 6 months that bank lending has picked up a little, slowed a little. It's around 6% growth, but money supply growth is 13%. And the difference between the growth in bank lending and money supply is entirely down to the Bank of England. The money supply currently is growing 3 times the normal rate of around 4% a year. In America, it's growing at 4 times the normal rate, and in Europe, it's growing twice the normal rate. So if you look at the global system, everyone's turned the tap up. Money coming into the global pipe is growing, well, it's at 17% of global GDP. How long will it take for that money to go through the pipe? Well, of course, we don't know the answer to that. The point is, though, that the money is there. Next slide. This shows you the state of bank accounts for the Brits. The red line is households, well, red bar is households, the black bar is your business, and the sort of grey bar is pension funds and insurance companies. Normally, the amount of money in accounts goes up by 8 billion a month. That's the average. But since March, since quantitative easing, it's been rising at 37 billion a month. Now, some of you online might say, well, I haven't got that money. Well, I'm sorry you haven't got that money. It means someone else is sitting on shed loads. There is a huge amount of money in our system. Next slide. This just shows you the global expansion. That big top line is the Federal Reserve. This chart is now out of date. The Fed has actually created just under $4 trillion. That is a massive stimulus. As I've said before, global stimulus is now 17% of global GDP. Next slide. So we know there's an awful lot of money coming into our system. What's happening to flow through? Is it moving through our system? And there are 2 timely indicators of the velocity of our money: retail sales and the Purchasing Managers Index. Retail sales are 30% of the flow through our pipe, and the data does include online ordering, which of course is now itself about 38% of retail. The Purchasing Managers Index is 800 companies are basically sent a questionnaire every month by a company called Market, and the key question asked is, next month, will you be increasing your order rate compared to this month? And what you get is a very simple chart, 0 to 100. Anything over 50 means the majority said they were increasing their order rate next month compared to this month. But let's take a look at retail sales data. Next slide. This is for the UK, and those of you who heard me before said we're going to get a V. Well, there it is. This is not bang up to date. We are still waiting for the detail for September, but that is August latest. And you can see that retail sales are 4% higher in the UK than they were before lockdown. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't hear that on the news. Next slide. If we go to Europe, you see a slightly different picture. Their massive increase in retail sales came in earlier because lockdown ended earlier. And their retail sales petered out when you began to get little lockdowns coming in. Think of your hose pipe. There's this surge of money through the pipe, but of course it's not maintained. It reduces pressure. And I think that's what you see in the European retail sales data. Next slide. Ireland, very similar to ourselves. Next slide. So let's look at UK Manufacturing Pmi. And this is for September. And the key point to note is that there's been a slight reduction compared to August, but it's still above 50, which means the majority of people in manufacturing are increasing their order month on month. I accept it's from that low base in April, but it's still expansion. But you'll say to me, manufacturing is only what, 12, 14% of GDP? That's not very helpful. All right, so it's services we need to look at. Let's look at it. Next slide. And you see services show a very similar pattern. So the idea that the economy is stuck or is not expanding is just wrong. It's fair to say we aren't back in GDP terms at the level we were before COVID, but we are on the way to doing that. Next slide. This is construction. Again, a little slowdown, but it's still growth. Next slide. So we add all the sectors together, and that's the composite index. And that says to me there has been a slight pause, that's not a good word, a slight reduction in the rate of expansion. And that was reflected in the monthly GDP figures. Not as good as we all had hoped, but still growing. Next slide. This is the Eurozone, and you can see that the rate of expansion has slowed a bit there, but it's still positive. Next slide. So these are my forecasts for annual and quarterly growth. Q3, we don't have all the data finalized yet, I thought plus 12. I think it's probably going to come in at about a plus 9 or 10 on Q2. Q4 plus 4, I still think that will happen, assuming no national lockdown. And then we go into next year, and you see the sort of quarterly growth that is pretty normal, which is plus 3, plus 4. And inevitably, the quarterly growth slows down because you're back up to running speed. So by the end of the next year, GDP will have grown by 10% compared to this year. Again, assuming no national lockdown. And what this data shows us so far is we've experienced the shortest but deepest recession since records began. Next slide. So what's happening to the global economy? Well, it's growing and recovering strongly. This chart I like. It is the freight rate for bringing a container from Asia to Europe. And those freight rates respond almost immediately to changes in supply and demand. In fairness, there has been a little reduction in capacity, but not much. And you can see rates have been rising significantly as consumers in Europe buy more stuff from Asia. And indeed, it suggests that global exports currently are only 5% below the Jan 2020 level. This is not a global system in crisis. Next slide. So, what about the lasting impact of COVID-19? Well, most Western governments have adopted something called modern monetary theory, and I'm going to explain that in my next slide. Home working, we know, is being established as a part of normal life. And who would imagine that we'd be doing what we're doing this morning, a year ago? Online ordering, and a retailer who was thinking about getting online has been forced to get online to survive. That is common practice now. And I think that localism will be the new normal. We'll find that people will tend to, especially with families, want to live away from central cities into more rural towns with more space, more fresh air. So I think smaller rural towns will expand and relatively big cities contract. I think cities are very good at reinventing themselves, and I'm sure they will. But so many people will not be going into the city to work every day. They might go in twice or 3 times a week, but not every day. And COVID has brought about something called creative destruction. I'm going to talk more about that later on in the presentation. But there is a cost to all this, which is that white-collar unemployment is going to rise, and it's going to stay up for a few years. This is due to this creative destruction. Okay, what I want to take you through is modern monetary theory. Now, this is the sort of thing you should know, and if you ever have the opportunity to go to a pub and you hear people say, oh, this is such a disaster, all this debt, our taxes are going to go through the roof. I heard on the radio this morning that the Chancellor's got to take 40 billion more taxes off us. Well, modern monetary theory says not necessarily so. Let's look at the next slide. Modern monetary theory has its roots about 30 years ago, but it's become very popular since 2010. You see, when there was the last bout of quantitative easing, government said, well, we're going to have to pay this debt off. And indeed, they've done their best to do that by austerity. And in particular, governments cut their capital budgets back to the bone, which is why the road network wasn't expanded and it's why school buildings began to fall down. And not unsurprisingly, if you underinvest in the nation's infrastructure, productivity doesn't grow. And by 2016, 17, governments in the West were fretting. What's happened to productivity? Our tax base is not increasing, and we've got all these old pensioners to pay for. What are we going to do? Answer: get productivity up. How? Start improving the nation's infrastructure. How do we do it? Well, this is the magic money tree. You see, the government has its own bank, the Bank of England. The government can borrow directly from that bank if it so chooses, and currently it is choosing. All the new money, that 180 billion that's come into our system has come from the Bank of England, not from the taxpayer. And very simply, the way it happens is government raises debt each month at an auction, and it tries to get banks and building societies and pension funds to buy their bonds. It's an auction, and the price of those bonds determines the rate of interest. Well, the Bank of England has agreed that it will buy all the bonds in issue at the best price, thus keeping interest rates extremely low. So the Bank of England gets the bonds, the government gets the money, the government spends the money. But those bonds have a coupon, that's a rate of interest payable. And that interest gets paid by the Treasury to the holder of the bond, which is the central bank. So the central bank starts making shed loads of profit. Well, it's not allowed to make profit, it's supposed to break even. So its owner, the government, says, by the way, all this extra profit you've got, pay it back to us in the form of a special dividend. In this way, modern monetary theory says you can have infrastructure, you can have better education, and it can be financed by new money. Thus, interest rates don't have to go up. This is happening in Britain, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in America. And many of you will have heard the Daily Mail and the Daily Express saying, oh, this is Zimbabwe, we're gonna get hyperinflation. It's not Zimbabwe. We are gonna get a bit more inflation, but not hyperinflation. And other people will say, oh, well, it won't work, you know. Well, there's one country that's been doing this since 1980. And I just suggest have a look at the pictures of China online, the largest high-speed rail network in the world, the most modern airports in the world. This is all done using newly created money. Why didn't the Chinese inflation rate take off? Well, they raised their productivity. So that's modern monetary theory, and I have a lovely time explaining it to people. I hope you understand it, but people find it offends. And they say, look, you know, I'm running a business, I have to pay down my debt, and that is true. Let's just for a moment assume that the nation is a business, and we look at its debt. Its debt is 2.2 trillion pounds sterling. Then let's look at its assets. They're valued at 10 trillion. So if you look at what's called the leverage, the debt to equity, it's only 22%. We could borrow lots more if we need to. And the other thing you'll say to me is, but you have to pay the interest out of your current income. I have to pay it out of my profits. Well, at the moment, the interest bill is taking up 7% of the government's current income. So the nation is not over-indebted. Some individuals might be, but the nation as a whole is not. Next slide, please. I just mentioned, is it inflationary? Well, it's not hyperinflationary, and the inflation rate will go up. I'm forecasting this time next year it'll be 4%. And there's been another change here, and that is that banks in the Western world always targeted inflation on a month-by-month basis. So if inflation is above 3% last month, there is a chance the Bank of England and other banks raise interest rates this month. And central bankers meet every year. Well, they met online in Jackson Hole in the Rockies in early August, and they discussed the sense of what they were doing. And they decided it was better to look at inflation averaged over a number of years, over a cycle, before rushing to change interest rates. The Fed in America have fully adopted this, and I expect us in Britain and Europe to follow suit in the next 6 months, which means over the next few years, interest rates will be rising above 2%, inflation rates will be rising above 2%, but interest rates will not follow. So if inflation rate's 3, base rate is 0.1, the mortgage rate is 1.7%, money over the next few years is free. Taxes will not rise in the next 18 months. Thereafter, they will rise to pay primarily the increased pension and health bill in the country. Next slide. I want to look at the housing market because the media have emphasized that prices next year are expected to fall 17%. And it's true that if house prices fall 17%, consumer confidence is trashed because in the Western world, most people hold their wealth in their house. And the perceived value of that house determines their confidence and their spending. If you look at that slide, I'm saying a rise in unemployment does not damage the housing market. We know unemployment's going to rise. It's going to be structural unemployment, and your sector, the hospitality sector, will be laying off lots of youngsters over the next 3 months. We know that it's a real issue, but it's not going to kill the housing market. Let's look at the next slide. This chart shows unemployment. And that first blue-purple area is the unemployment 1980 to 1989. It averaged 8%, it peaked over 12%. It was over 3 million people throughout that period. Average house prices rose each year by 13%. So if you bought a house in 1980, by 1986, you'd have doubled your wealth. So unemployment rising strongly had no impact on house prices. In fact, you can argue that house prices went up as unemployment went up because a house is seen as a hedge against inflation. However, let's look at the period 1990 to the year 2000. And here unemployment fell rapidly. House prices only grew on average each year at 3%. So I'm sorry, but the evidence does not support the rational argument. Remember, I'm a behavioralist. The rational argument is lots of unemployed means the death of the housing market. History tells us that ain't so. Next slide. Well, this slide just covers the point I've raised. Let's move to the next one. If you look at where we are today, it does make sense to buy. Money is virtually free, and it is actually cheaper to have a house with a mortgage than rent a house. That's the latest data. But you'll say to me, look, people can't afford the deposit. And I agree, under normal circumstances, people can't. The level of unemployment is going to rise to 3 million. We know that. That means there'll still be 30 million people employed in this country. And I'd like you to think of a young professional, perhaps in their early 30s, a digital marketeer, working in London normally on a salary, what, 45, that sort of figure? And they couldn't afford to live in London, to rent in London, so they live in Peterborough. And they travelled in every day on the fast train. I think the season ticket from Peterborough to London, 7 grand. Okay, and then they'll have a beer with their workmates in the West End, £6 a pint. One of their mates might decide to get married and have a 3-day stag weekend in Barcelona. You see where I'm going here? None of that in the last 6 months has happened. So that young professional has been forced to save the first time in their life because they can't spend. They could well have saved 6-7 grand. And their parents are also finding that they haven't been going on holiday spending like they used to. And so conversations, probably on Zoom, say, well, look, you've got 10 grand, we can lend you 20 grand, you've got your deposit, off you go. Next slide. The Bank of Mum and Dad are the 10th largest supplier of housing finance in Britain. And because of what I've said to you, and because the money supply is growing at 13% year on year, I expect, despite unemployment, house prices to rise between 5 and 8% next year. Most people are saying minus 17. Those people also said this year it would be minus 8. And so far, prices are up 3. I rest my case. The important point about increasing house prices, it does support consumer spending. Next slide. I want to look at this thing called creative destruction. And it's basically the core theory of innovation. A bloke called Schumpeter in the 30s was trying to create a theory of innovation, and he looked at a whole host of data. And what he noticed was inventions actually are random. Someone invents the steam engine, someone invents the PC, someone invents the internet. It's random. There's no pattern to it. But innovation, which is the invention put into use, well, that is not random. That clusters at particular points in a cycle. And there is a cycle of around 50 years. You get 30 above trend growth, followed by 20 below trend. And it's the innovation clustering where all the related activities come together to create something magical, something new, that creates this big upswing. Next slide. See, creative destruction, and you might be doing this right now, is where you are trialing a new way of doing stuff, but you're not confident it's going to work properly, so you keep the old way as well. And you effectively run two ways of working in parallel. And then when you're confident about the new way, you drop the old way. And the great thing about the new way always is it's more productive. It's more productive in the sense it either reduces your cost base or it allows you to increase your revenues. What creative destruction does is, yes, it causes structural unemployment, but simultaneously it raises productivity and income per person. Next slide. Here are the big innovation curves we've experienced since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And if you take the railway example, the first railway was not designed to be a passenger carrier. No one thought of that. It was designed to carry coal, to carry ore, to carry grain. And people decided they would go for rail just to offset the monopoly pricing of those who owned the canals. Where we are today is clearly the beginning of huge clustering. And one of the things I'd like to illustrate is the quantum computer. This is an invention. It's been around a long time, about 20 years. It's only now you're beginning to get the clustering, which means support services find out how to keep a quantum computer stable. For example, that's an engineering project. And Google, huge investor in quantum computing because of their ability to crunch large numbers. Google announced 3 weeks ago that their quantum computer crunched numbers in 4 minutes that would have taken a traditional computer 1,000 years to do. So if you get your head around this crunchability, it spawns innovation in medicine, in communications, and I'm sure in entertainment. You know, the more powerful the computer, the better the gaming we can have, and so on. So quantum computing is the next big thing. How am I sure about that? Next slide. Venture capitalists like to take risk, but they like to take considered risk. And there's a huge amount of VC money moving into quantum computing. And that supply of money will encourage others. This is going to be very big. It's going to be very productive. I hope I don't sound like Donald Trump. Please forgive me if I do. Next slide. So it's not going to be quantum computers that bring about the structural unemployment in the UK. It's going to be more mundane. And if you look at the sectors that have had proportion of staff furloughed, it's your sector. It's the hospitality sector. It's that big bar at the top. I don't think we're going to see significant structural change there. I think it's the third category down, which is back office, essentially. And I think over this next 3 years, we're going to see significant automation of back office processes. And of course, this will allow more and more people to operate from their homes rather than travel into a city. It will also result in a loss of white-collar jobs. Luckily, a lot of those white-collar workers will have transferable skills. So the HR specialist moves from actually being in an HR role to designing software to help speed up HR. I think that's where the change is going to be. If we look at that big bar at the top, all we need is the economy to be fully opened for the majority of those people to be employed again. And we know many of them are under 30, which means, by the way, they probably weren't in the housing market in the first place. Next slide. Oh, I've just said all that. Next slide. So my conclusion, the rate of innovation has speeded up, particularly in the last 6 months, and it will increase the average rate of unemployment. Money supply growth will ensure a rapid expansion of our economy and the global economy over the next 2 years. In fact, looking beyond the next 3 months, I really do believe we are at the beginning of an inflationary boom. And when we look back in 3-5 years' time, when we've got vaccines and we know how to deal with COVID 20, 21, 22, because it will be like the flu bug, it's with us now. I think when we look back, we'll say, do you know what? COVID was the big kicker for structural change. It was tough, but we got through it. Next slide. The EU and the UK will agree a trade deal. It'll be bare bones, but it will be done. Both sides need it. Neither side can take the cost of WTO rules. At the last minute, that deal will be done. How will it be done? Well, we will agree to an independent adjudication of our subsidy levels. We will trade fish again. We've done it ever since the beginning of time. And there'll be a deal. Inflation, as I said, will be 4%, I believe, by August next year. But there are not going to be any increase in interest rates over the next 18 months. Taxes certainly will not be increased in Britain until the post-COVID recovery is fully established. We're certainly looking not for a year at least. Cities will have to reinvent themselves, rural towns will expand, and basically there has been a turbocharging of change. So you might say to me, look, we're really suffering, and I'm sure you are. And I know I expected more theatres to be open by now, and we know they're not. And we know there are no big rock concerts, and we know the events industry is on its knees, and we know why. And I can't offer any comfort there. I wish I could. But I am sure many of you are looking at different ways of using your expertise, and it will come good, but it will be tough as we get there. So thank you for paying attention. I hope it makes sense to you, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you've got. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Roger. What a brilliant 45-minute session. Thank you very much indeed. I hope everybody enjoyed that as much as I did. We do have some questions, so let me start off then. The first question is, do you think the cure is worse than the disease? And I guess that's an economic cure, I guess.
Well, I'm one of those that, and it makes me unpopular, we should not ruin the lives of the majority to save the few. I know that sounds hard, so I think I'm agreeing with the questioner. I mean, if you look at the data, it's clear. Most of those who die are over 80 and have underlying conditions anyway. And so, yeah, maybe if I was 95 and feeling ill, I wouldn't be saying this. But I think we have to think of the next generation, not the generation that's about to depart this world anyway.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers his question for him, or her question. Next question is, given the events industry's contribution to the economy, quite apart from the quality of the benefits it brings to life, can you see any logic in the government's lack of support for us? Do you think this lack of support will lead to a weaker sector coming out of the recession and consequently a slower recovery?
It's a very good question. And your sector, taken as a whole, that's leisure and entertainment, is 7% of GDP. So if you don't come out of this, then our economy will be smaller. I can't understand why the government hasn't given more support. It's really important that events, entertainment on every level its capacity is maintained. But I suppose there's a little bit of good news, and that is many of the people employed in the industry do have transferable skills. So, it's not as if it's a miner who loses a job forever. I think the industry will adapt, but capacity clearly is reducing as we speak. And government, given its modern monetary theory, should be doing more. It's a major, major component of our economy and a source of our competitive advantage. And we're supposed to be becoming another global power. So we should have given and should consider giving support to your industry.
Brilliant. Well, that's a unanimous thought from all of us as well, and continue to talk to government and to lobby government to try and get them to understand what we actually do, because I think they struggle to do that. Another couple of questions. One is, if you were a senior manager in our sector, where would you focus your attention in the next 2 years? So if I could split that maybe. So if you were a senior manager in a production rental house, where would you be focused on? Because those are the people that make up a lot of the supply chain to the events. Where would you be focused? And then maybe flip that to a manufacturer as well.
I wish I could give a 5-point answer. You need to do this, this, and this. I think if you're a production company, you're a senior manager, you've got to think very, very, very hard about your core competence. What is it? What business are we really in? What is it we're really good at? And to what extent can we apply this skill set to a different channel to market, or even to a different line of business? I don't know what the answer will be, but I think you have to be absolutely clear what you really are. If you're a manufacturer, I think the same argument is applicable. You'll have a whole set of skills. The demand for rigging, the demand for lighting is probably on the floor right now. So what else could you do with your capacity? I'm sure you're doing that. I do not have an answer for you. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. We do have other questions. So Well, this is a quite simple one. Was any debt paid off by the government? I guess we're referring back to earlier on in your presentation.
No, government has paid no debt off in the last 9 months. It's steadily increasing its debt. It's increased its debt since March by 210 billion.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. And we have one other question here, which is, let me just read this one through. It says, do you believe in a deeper political angle? In very broad terms, if the white-collar jobs are destroyed quickly, so this is too many people working at home, sending no value, blah, 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 and the working class are ever more exploited, do you foresee a violent backlash?
Oh,
that's a big one, isn't it?
It is a good one. We only do violence in exceptional cases in Britain. If you think of the Brixton riots, I do think we're going to see more and more anguish, dismay, and unhappiness. And for example, I'm one of those individuals who thinks that we should have a government of national unity. I don't think we should have the current structure. I think there should be Labour members of cabinet, some Lib Dems in there, just to get a much more balanced approach to things. I don't see riots in the street, but I do see a lot of angry social media comment as people vent because they're, putting it bluntly, pissed off.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hope that answers your question, Simon. We have another question here. Are there examples of similar scale economic events impacting specific industries that has then seen those areas recover and thrive? So I guess that it's talking about our specific sector, which is on its knees and has been since COVID arrived, with, you know, practically zero revenue for so much of the supply chain to events. So are there any other examples in other industries where there's been a massive collapse and those sectors have come back and really thrived?
Well, I think the answer to that is a major player in an industry, and that's IBM. In the late 70s, early 80s, IBM's expertise was big computers. And then the PC came into existence. And for 3 years, IBM said, no, 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 no. You know, the idea that everyone has a computer on their desk is complete nonsense. And they nearly went under. So they had to reinvent themselves. And they reinvented themselves initially by becoming a consultancy, basically, not a manufacturer on any scale. And then subsequent to that, they are now, of course, very much into cloud, which depends on big computers. So that's a small example. In terms of whole industry, well, right now you're seeing this massive change in the motor industry as people go electric. You'll know an electric car only has about 8 moving parts, lot less complex in terms of components. So you're seeing structural change there. In fact, I want to say to you, you're seeing structural change everywhere right now, and we just have to embrace it and create, innovate.
Okay, thank you, Roger. This is the last question. It's a very simple question. So some of the data and some of the slides you've shown us today, and you share with us each time you present to us, why did the press not share any of these facts with us? Why would they be not sharing this information with us?
Well, if I can give you a simple example, there was a recession 1990 to 92, and I did a weekly session for Radio Berkshire. And it was generally pretty miserable. And I was saying, yeah, the data's not great, blah, blah, blah. And then on the day we left the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, they said, will you go on air? And I said, yes. And the question was, so Roger, this is the biggest disaster to befall Britain. I said, absolutely not. This is the best thing that could happen. The boom starts now. They said, no, you've got to agree. It's awful. I said, no, it's not. It's really good. And they never asked me again. And I think this sums it up. The media doesn't do good news.
Okay, brilliant. I think that is our time done with regard to Q&A. No other last questions have come in, so thank you to those people who sent in questions. A big thank you to you, Roger. We do really appreciate all this information you pass on and helping with our own learning and embracing what's going to be coming to us over the next couple of years. So a really big thank you from us, and hopefully, you know, maybe we'll get back to the point where we can have an AGM again, where people can actually meet each other and say hi to each other, and it would be fantastic if you could come along to that. So Thank you again, Roger. Thank you again, and thanks to everybody who joined us this morning, and we'll see you for the next session very shortly. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.